Hello again, it's David Stokes from Convalido Consulting again, and in this video we're going to look at the data attributes associated with the data operation shapes in the Convalido data lifecycle modeling tool, so that you can understand how the data attributes are intended to be used and how you can think about those in documenting your risk assessments. So if I switch to the tool, again we've got a blank diagram you can see here, and all I'm going to do is select one of the shapes. So let's just take a data storage shape, anyone will do. So I've just picked here single data with metadata that's being stored. So you can see there we've got the shape selected, and if I right click, you'll see a little menu opens up, and if I scroll down here to data, you'll see 5 little options open up there, and again all I'm going to look at is shape data. And each of the shapes we have for each of the data operations has a number of data attributes associated with them. For each of the data operations, except the electronic record, these attributes are exactly the same, and that's what allows us to do the risk assessment outputs in a consistent manner. So essentially the data we can enter for any particular data operation, first of all, is the name of the data. So something that describes what the actual data is. So let's pick something very simple. So we've identified a data item here. This would typically be in a process control system. So who the data owner is. So typically we're looking here about somebody's role rather than their name. Again, that's to allow for people in the organisation changing. Basically, data owners should be defined by their role in the organisation rather than their role. And we could assume that at this particular point in the life cycle, the data is owned by a process engineer because the data is being processed, stored in a PLC system, for an example. Under data storage, we can select a number of options. So is the data stored short term or is it long term? Now obviously from this data storage symbol you can see here, which has got the dotted outline, this would typically be temporary storage, so we would select short term, and then in free text we can enter the data storage period. So for instance, data overwritten at end of batch, something which typically happens in the process control world. Data will be stored locally, a copy of it will be transferred somewhere else, and then it will be overwritten. So now we can start thinking about the risk scenarios. So what are the risks associated with this piece of data that's stored in the PLC on a temporary basis? So the first problem we might have, for instance, is unauthorized access. Now, if you have unauthorized access, it can lead to data falsification before the data is stored permanently, but the data may also be corrupted. It might be deleted. So again, we need to think about the specific risk scenarios that are pertinent in this particular case. We then think about the risk severity. Now, risk severity is included twice. First of all, before we put any risk controls in place. So risk severity typically will be high. Again, we're only recommending that this lifecycle modelling tool is used to develop detailed life cycles for high risk data. So in most cases, it's going to be high risk severity. What's the risk probability if we don't put any controls in place? So we might assume that's medium. Risk detectability, well, if we never look at the data to check, it's going to be low. And if I remember my GAMP risk assessment tables correctly, that gives us a high risk priority. So what controls can we put in place for this particular step? Well, the first thing we can do is secure access to authorized users. We can install a uninterruptible power supply. If this is in volatile memory, for instance, that will help mitigate any issues with data loss or corruption during lack of power supply. So that should address our risk scenarios of unauthorized access and also data being deleted accidentally. We then ask ourselves, how is this data going to be audited or logged at this stage? Now, this is temporary storage. We're not going to require an audit trail, but it might be possible to have a system log for any changes to the data in the PLC. Again, whether or not you choose to apply these controls depends upon the risk. Again, we're dealing with high severity data here, high risk severity data, so we're going to put some controls in place. We'll then ask ourselves the question, how often will we review this data to make sure that the controls are effective? Now, we're not going to do 100% manual review. That's impractical. That's not something the regulators ask us to do, but it might be an idea, possibly as part of a periodic review process or a revalidation exercise, just to make sure that this is working properly, so we can make it subject to periodic review, and we can put permissions in place to restrict access. Helps if I can spell, doesn't it? So we're going to restrict access in the process engineer role. Again, this assumes that our PLC is capable of restricting access using role-based permissions. Not all PLCs may be possible. We might not be able to put this control in place, in which case we might have to look at changing the equipment, for instance. So after we've put these risk controls in place, the risk severity should stay the same. It's the same data, so the risk is the same. The probability, we should have reduced it to low. If we're putting some sort of periodic review process in place, hopefully our detectability is improved, and that should reduce our risk to medium. Operation is pre-filled, so this describes what the operation is. That's part of the stencil, but you can change that if you want. And finally, we put a step number in here. We'll just make this step number 1. And if you look above the top right of the actual symbol itself, as I type in the step number, it actually appears on the graphic there. So those are all the data fields that we can have as standard. What you can also do, though, if I right click on the symbol again, if you go to data and define shape data, if you want to, you can add additional fields or delete fields. That's completely up to you. You're free to customize the stencil as you wish. So maybe you think there's too much data included here. It may be that there are some additional items of risk-based data you also want to append that might come out of your own risk management process. So you're free to do that using the standard Visio define shape data function. I won't go into that in detail here. Please read the Visio help for more information.